The sky was full of smoke and fire, and broken ships were falling from the clouds like dead birds. Captain Raynor stood near the edge of a ruined building and looked through his visor as the dust settled in the air. He was a human soldier, and he was sent on a mission to find any alien survivors in this area. He was not alone because his team was close behind him, and they were ready to fire if needed. This planet was once a home to many alien families, but now it was only ashes and silence. Raynor walked forward and gave hand signals to his team to spread out and search the area. As he moved through the broken streets, he saw old toys and clothes and small shoes that told stories of the people who once lived here. He felt something strange in his chest, like a small voice asking if this was really victory. Suddenly, he heard a soft sound like someone crying, and he stopped and raised his hand. Team froze and looked around, and one soldier said it might be a trap, but Raynor shook his head. The sound was not from a soldier and not from a beast, because it was soft and scared and full of pain. Raynor followed the sound into a destroyed lab with cracked walls and burnt doors, stepped inside and turned on his flashlight and slowly walked through the darkness. There in the corner behind broken machines, he saw two figures hiding under a metal table. One was an alien woman, and the other was a small alien child holding her tightly. Their eyes were wide and full of fear, and their clothes were torn and dirty. The child made a small cry and held her mother closer, and Raynor took a step back. He raised his hand to show he had no weapon in it, and spoke in a calm voice. "I am not here to hurt you," he said slowly, but they did not understand his words. Still, they could see his face, and maybe they saw something kind in his eyes. Raynor looked at the woman and saw her hands were shaking, but she did not move. He opened his pack and placed a water bottle on the ground and pushed it towards them. The child looked at it, and then at her mother, and then slowly crawled forward and took the bottle. She drank with small hands, shaking, and Raynor could see she had not eaten or drunk for a long time. His radio cracked with a voice asking for a report. He pressed the button and said, "Area's clear, no signs of life, moving to next zone." He turned the radio off and looked back at the two aliens, and they looked back at him. He knew this was against the rules because aliens were enemies and he should report them. But when he saw the child, he did not see an enemy because he saw someone who needed help. He whispered to himself, "What are we doing here? What are we really fighting for?" He looked around and found an old blanket and gave it to the woman, and she took it with slow hands. Her eyes were tired, but they showed a small light of hope, and Raynor felt something break inside him. He could not leave them here, and he could not call for help, so he made a choice. He told them to follow him, and they did because they had no other choice. He led them through dark paths and empty tunnels and kept checking to make sure his team was far away. Finally, they reached an old bunker hidden under the rocks where no one would think to look. Raynor opened the door and told them to go inside, and they did without a sound. He gave them food and water and sat near the door and looked at them. The child smiled a little, and the woman nodded in thanks, and Raynor felt something warm in his chest. This was not just a mission anymore, and this was not just war, because this was something else. Looked up at the ceiling and took a deep breath, and thought of the orders he was breaking. He thought of his team and his commander and the punishment waiting if anyone found out, but he also thought of the child and her eyes and how she had held the water like it was treasure. Outside, the wind blew strong, and the ruins whispered the stories of those who once lived inside the bunker. A small alien girl slept beside her mother, and a human soldier stood guard, and far away in the sky, a camera watched silently and sent a signal back to the base. A red light blinked and a screen turned on, and someone watched the footage with cold eyes. The voice on the other end said, "We have movement in Sector 9. Send a team and prepare for questioning." But Raynor did not know this, and he only listened to the soft breathing of the child as the night grew darker. This mission had changed something inside him, and he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Rain fell softly on the roof of the old bunker, and each drop made a quiet sound that echoed in the silence below. Captain Raynor sat with his back against the wall and his eyes fixed on the sleeping figures. In the corner, the alien woman Vera held her daughter close, and both were wrapped in a blanket that Raynor had found among the ruins. He did not sleep because his mind was heavy with the weight of his choice, had broken orders and hidden enemies of the state, but when he looked at the child he could not feel regret. Morning came with a gray sky, and the bunker smelled of rust and old. Raynor stood up and walked to the small panel near the door, and checked the outside feed from a tiny camera. Nothing moved, but still he felt the pressure building like a storm just beyond the hills. He opened a small box and took out 2 food bars and a water pouch and gave them to Vera. She took them slowly and gave one to her daughter, who smiled. With small sleepy eyes, Raynor sat again and tried to speak slowly, pointing to himself and saying his name. Raynor, he said once and then again, pointing with his finger. Vera looked at him and nodded once, and then she pointed at herself and said Vera. Then she touched her daughter gently and said Luma in a soft voice. Luma looked at Raynor and smiled again and tried to repeat his name. With a small giggly sound came from Raynor's wrist, and he looked down quickly to see a message flashing on his device. Return to base now, Captain. Your report is overdue, and command wants answers. Looked at the screen for a long moment and then turned it off without replying. He stood up and walked to the door and looked back once more at Vera and Luma. Stay here, he said slowly, and pointed to the ground and raised his hand in a calm gesture. They watched him go without a word, but their eyes were full of fear. Raynor stepped out into the cold air and closed the bunker door behind him and walked quickly through the empty land. He reached his transport and started it with quiet hands and drove toward the human base without speaking. At the base, the guards looked at him with sharp eyes, and one of them spoke into a radio. Before letting him pass, Raynor walked into the command center where his superior, Commander Briggs, waited with arms crossed. You were out of contact for 10 hours. Captain, explain yourself, said Briggs. In a firm tone, Raynor stood straight and said, System failure, sir. The storm must have damaged the signal booster. Briggs narrowed his eyes and said, We picked up movement in your sector, and we want to know what you found. Raynor replied, I found signs of life, but no threats, only burned structures and empty streets. Nothing worth reporting, sir. Briggs stared at him for a long moment and then nodded slowly but said, Next time stay in touch, or we will send someone to find you. Raynor saluted and walked away, but he felt the cold eyes of another man following him. Sergeant Cole stood near the wall with arms crossed and a smirk on his face. Cole had always been sharp and curious, and Raynor knew he had to be more careful now. Raynor returned to the barracks and sat on his bed and looked at the small map on his wrist device. He checked the signal from the bunker, and it was still stable and hidden. He wanted to go back, but he knew it would look suspicious, so he waited for night to fall. Meanwhile, back at the bunker, Vera moved slowly through the shadows and found a small shelf with old papers. She looked at them carefully and found one, a symbol she knew from her past. It was the mark of peace from long ago, when humans and her people were allies. She looked at Luma, who slept peacefully, and felt a tear roll down her cheek. When Raynor returned under the cover of darkness, he knocked softly, and Vera opened the door. Slowly he stepped inside and closed the door and sat down with a deep breath. Vera showed him the paper and pointed to the symbol, and then to herself, and then to him. Raynor looked at it, and his face changed as he began to understand. This war was not how it started, and maybe someone had turned allies into enemies for a reason. He felt anger and confusion, but also something like hope. Outside in the dark hills, a figure watched from behind a rock and then moved back toward the human base. Sergeant Cole had followed him, and now he knew the truth. Back at the base, he opened a secure channel and sent a short message. Found something unusual. Recommend full scan of Sector 9. In the bunker, Raynor looked at Luma, who now sat near him playing with a piece of wire. He smiled and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt human again, but outside the danger was growing, and soon his secret would no longer be safe. The mission had started with orders and weapons, but now it was something else. Now it was about life and truth, and something worth fighting for, and soon he would have to choose again. The night was quiet, and the stars above blinked slowly like they were watching everything below with silent eyes. Captain Raynor stood near the entrance of the old bunker and looked toward the hills where the shadows moved like ghosts. He had returned to base in the morning after spending the night with Vera and Luma in silence, and thought his mind was full of questions that had no answers and truths that felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Back at the base, the air felt colder, and the people felt more distant, like something invisible had changed everything. Sergeant Cole watched him from across the yard with a look that was calm on the outside, but sharp on the inside. Raynor walked to the command tent where Commander Briggs waited with a map spread across the table and reports stacked beside him. "We have new satellite scans of Sector 9, said Briggs, "and they show faint energy signatures that we do not recognize." Raynor nodded and replied, "Must be old tech from the labs." "Sir, nothing active." When I passed through, Briggs looked up and narrowed his eyes and said, "Cole says you were acting strange yesterday, and your report was late." Raynor kept his voice steady and said, "I lost track of time, sir. The terrain was more difficult than expected." Briggs said nothing for a long moment, and then waved him away with a tired hand and turned back to the map. Raynor left the tent and walked slowly through the camp and felt the weight of every eye that followed him. He knew time was running out, and the more he returned to the bunker, the more questions would rise. That night he took a new route through the hills and made sure no one saw him leave. When he reached the bunker, Vera was waiting, and she smiled softly when she saw him. Luma ran to him and hugged his leg and laughed, and Raynor felt something inside him light up. He sat down with them and took out a small bag of fruit bars he had hidden in his gear and gave them one by one. Vera unrolled a small piece of paper she had found and showed it to him with a serious look in her eyes. Raynor took the paper and looked closely and saw a faded image of a human and an alien shaking hands, with a peace symbol above them. Below the image were words in both languages that said "Alliance of Future and Protection for All." Raynor looked at Vera and said slowly, "This is before the war, right?" And she nodded once with pain in her eyes. He said, "I never saw this before," and she pointed to a small mark on her sleeve, the same as the symbol on the paper. She was part of the old alliance, and her people were once friends of Earth. Raynor felt anger rise in his chest, and he asked who started the war and why. Vera reached into her coat and pulled out a broken data chip and handed it to him with careful fingers. She pointed to the chip and then to a broken machine in the corner that once was a scanner. Raynor walked over and tried to fix the machine using wires and tools from his kit, and after a long moment, it blinked to life. Screen showed old footage with dates from 5 years ago, and voices from human officers talking about secret orders. The words were clear and cold. "Remove the aliens before they rise too far. Remove the threat before peace weakens our command." Raynor stepped back and stared at the screen and felt like the ground was shaking under him. War had started not because of danger, but because of fear and power and lies. He looked at Vera and then at Luma, and he knew he could never go back to who he was before. Outside in the dark, Cole stood behind a tree with binoculars and watched the scene inside the bunker with narrow eyes. He had followed Raynor again, and now he saw the truth with his own eyes. He turned and whispered into his radio, "Target confirmed, send team at dawn." Raynor, inside the bunker, looked at Vera and said, "We need to move soon. They will come and they will not stop." Vera nodded and took Luma into her arms and held her close, and Raynor packed his things with quick hands. He gave Vera a small necklace with a tracker hidden inside and said, "If we get separated, follow the signal." Night felt colder than before, and every sound outside felt louder and sharper. Raynor stepped out of the bunker and scanned the hills and saw nothing. But still he felt watched. Back at the base, Cole met with Briggs and showed him a blurry photo of Raynor with the aliens. Briggs said nothing for a while and then gave a cold order, "Detain him quietly. We need him alive for answers." As dawn touched the sky, Raynor led Vera and Luma through the back trails and silent caves. He knew the paths better than anyone, and he moved with the speed of a man who had already made his choice. Behind them, silent drones moved like shadows ready to strike without Warning. Raynor stopped and looked back at the land he once called a mission zone. But now it was something more now. It was a place of truth and hope and something worth protecting. He turned to Vera and said, "We keep moving. We do not stop no matter what." The sun rose over the hills and painted the ruins gold and red, and the chase had truly begun. And far away in a dark room, a figure watched the feed with a smile that held no warmth at all. The air was heavy, and the morning sun tried to break through the thick clouds that hung low over the hills like a warning. Captain Raynor moved quickly through the narrow path with Vera close behind him, holding little Luma in her arms. Each step felt louder than the last, as if the world around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Raynor stopped for a moment and looked around with sharp eyes and placed a small signal jammer on a rock before moving again. The device would hide their trail for a little while, but he knew the clock was ticking and every second counted. Vera walked in silence, but her eyes were alert and full of questions that her mouth never asked. Raynor turned and said softly, "We head toward the south caves. There's a transport pod hidden deep inside one of the shafts." He did not know if they would reach it in time, but it was the only option left behind them in the forest. Sergeant Cole moved like a wolf with quiet steps and focused breath. He had followed Raynor's path with care, and now he knew the location of the bunker and the direction they were heading in his hand. He held a secure device blinking red with a signal ready to send. He raised it to his mouth and whispered, "Confirmation, target is moving south, ETA 1 hour, request backup." Device crackled and a voice answered, "Copy that, unit en route, do not engage until we arrive." Cole smiled, but it was not the smile of victory. It was the smile of a man who thought he knew the truth and believed he was right. He moved forward and soon saw Raynor standing alone near a ridge, checking the wind and watching the sky. Raynor turned and did not reach for his weapon when he saw Cole step out from the trees. They stood in silence for a long moment, and then Cole spoke. "You lied to all of us, Raynor. You crossed the line, and now you are protecting the enemy." Raynor kept his voice calm and said, "They are not the enemy, Cole. They are just trying to survive, just like us." Cole's face hardened, and he said, "I saw the footage. I saw you with them. Do you think you can change how this ends?" Raynor said, "I can try, because what we are doing is wrong, and you know it deep down. You know it too." Cole stepped forward and said, "I should arrest you right now and take them in, but I am giving you a chance to walk away. Turn them over to me, and I will say you were just tracking them and following orders." Raynor shook his head and said, "No, I will not do that, and I will not let them suffer for something they did not do." Cole raised his weapon, and Raynor raised his hands but did not step back for a moment. Time felt frozen, and even the wind seemed to stop moving. Then a voice came from the trees, and Vera stepped out with Luma behind her, her hands raised and her eyes full of fear. Cole looked at her and then at the child, and something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone in an instant. He said, "You have 24 hours, Raynor. After that, I report everything, and they will come with full force." Raynor nodded and said, "That is more than I expected. Thank you." Cole lowered his weapon and turned away and walked back into the trees without another word. Raynor turned to Vera and said, "We keep moving. We have less time than we thought." They walked until the sky began to darken and the caves came into view like giant mouths carved into the hills inside the cave. Raynor used an old keypad to open a sealed hatch hidden behind thick vines and stone. Pod inside was dusty, but still functional, and Raynor began preparing it for launch. Vera placed Luma on a small seat and looked around the cave walls where old marks of her people were still scratched into the stone. Raynor said, "We leave before sunrise once the systems are warm and the signal is masked." Luma touched a small control panel with her hand, and the pod lights flickered and changed color to blue. Raynor looked at her and said, "She did something." "What just happened?" Vera looked at him and said in a quiet voice, "She carries something old, something powerful from my people. It is why they want her." Raynor's face changed, and he said, "What do you mean, who wants her?" Vera answered, "There are others, not just humans, but my own kind, who turned against us. They believe Luma is the key to awakening the old power." Raynor looked toward the entrance of the cave and knew that everything was now more dangerous than before. Outside, the sun fell behind the hills in darkness. Spread fast like a wave of cold fear far away, a transport ship touched down silently, and soldiers stepped out. With orders and weapons and eyes without mercy, and above them in the black sky, something else moved through the stars. Drawn by a signal it was never meant to hear. The stars above were brighter than usual, as if something far beyond the sky had opened its eyes for the first time in years. Captain Raynor stood at the edge of the cave mouth with one hand on his weapon and the other on the metal wall beside him. Was listening to the silence and waiting for a sound that would mean everything was about to change. Behind him, the transport pod hummed softly and small lights blinked in patterns. He did not understand. Vera sat inside holding Luma close while her eyes watched the entrance with quiet fear and steady strength. Raynor walked back to them and said, "The skies are too quiet. I do not trust it. Something is coming. I can feel it." Vera nodded and looked down at Luma, who was holding a small alien device in her hands, shaped like a crystal with soft blue light. "That thing is what she touched back at the bunker," Raynor said, "and since then signals have been spreading through the sky like echoes in space." Vera replied, "It is a beacon, but not just for help. It is older than war, older than fear. It calls something forgotten." Raynor looked at her and said, "What kind of something?" And her answer came slow and cold. "It calls the ancient ones, the watchers, the ones who sleep in the void, waiting for a voice to wake them." Raynor stepped back and ran a scan through his wristband and saw strange patterns moving through the digital screen with no clear source. He said, "Then we need to get away fast before that voice brings something we cannot fight." Vera held Luma tightly and whispered something in her own language, and Luma's eyes closed slowly like she was listening to a sound no one else could hear. Far above the planet, a silent ship moved like a shadow among the stars, large and dark and without any light except one red core pulsing in its center. It had no crew and no windows, and it moved with purpose, as if pulled by memory rather than command. Inside the ship, old machines woke and symbols began to glow, and maps appeared showing the world below. The ship had received the signal from Luma's touch, and it was now following the voice with perfect silence back inside the cave. Raynor was checking the pod's launch system when a sudden tremor shook the ground under his feet. Dust fell from the ceiling and small rocks rolled across the floor, and Vera stood up with alarm in her eyes. "That is not a normal tremor," Raynor said. "That was from the sky. Something just entered the upper atmosphere." He ran to the cave mouth and looked up to see a streak of dark light cutting through the stars like a blade. It vanished behind the clouds, but he knew whatever it was had landed and would be here soon. "We need to leave now," he said to Vera, and she helped Luma into the seat and strapped her in with quick hands. Suddenly a voice echoed through the cave from behind them, deep and sharp and filled with command. "Do not move," said Sergeant Cole as he stepped forward from the shadows with his weapon raised, and 3 soldiers behind him. Raynor stepped in front of Vera and Luma and said, "You do not know what you are doing." "Cole, get out of here now." Cole replied, "I know you broke every rule. I know you lied to your team. I know you hid an alien. And now I know you activated something dangerous." Raynor said, "This girl is not a danger. She's a key to something we do not understand. And if you shoot now, you might wake something worse." Cole looked at Luma, who was glowing faintly as the device in her hands pulsed with each heartbeat. Before he could speak again, the ground shook harder and the walls cracked, and a deep sound filled the air like a horn made from thunder. From the sky outside, a black figure fell like a stone with wings of smoke and landed near the cave entrance with force that shook the mountain. The soldiers turned and pointed their weapons as a creature stepped into view, tall and dark and made of metal and light. It had no face, only a mask with one single red line moving across like an eye. Cole whispered, "What is that?" And Raynor replied, "That is what she called with the signal." The creature stepped forward and raised one hand, and every device in the cave lost power in one instant, except the crystal in Luma's hand. Vera shouted in her language, and the creature stopped as if listening, and then turned its head toward the child. It knelt down slowly and placed one hand on the ground, and the rock beneath it glowed with the same blue light as the crystal. Raynor said we need to move now while it is not hostile. And Cole did not argue this time. Everyone backed into the pod, and Raynor started the engine with emergency override, and the hatch closed with a loud hiss. As they lifted off, the creature stood still, watching them with the red line moving slowly. From side to side, outside, more lights began to appear in the sky, one after another, each one a response to the ancient call now. Awakened inside the pod, Luma looked up and said one simple word in her soft voice, home. Raynor looked at her and knew that nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. The pod moved through the dark sky like a silent bird escaping the fire behind it, while the world below trembled with power. Both old and unknown Captain Raynor sat in the pilot seat with sweat on his brow and worry in his eyes as he watched the scanners blink with strange symbols he had never seen before. Behind him, Vera held Luma close while the child slept with the glowing crystal still in her hand, pulsing softly with light that did not belong to this world. Raynor said, we cannot return to base. They will shoot us down before we even speak, and we cannot go far into space because something is following that signal. Vera looked out the small window and said softly in her voice, we are between two storms, and both are moving faster than we are. The pod shook for a moment as a wave of energy passed near it like a breath from something large, and watching from the shadows, Raynor turned the controls and directed the pod toward a hidden location known only to old scouts like him, a floating satellite station lost after the First War and left drifting near the rings of a broken moon. They said we can hide there for a little while, just enough to think and to plan. The pod entered the station quietly and docked with a soft hiss as the old doors opened to a silent hall filled with dust and broken lights. Raynor helped Vera and Luma step out, and they walked through the station, finding a room with working systems and a secure lock. They sat in silence for a moment, and Raynor looked at Luma, who now stared at the crystal as if listening to a voice deep inside her soul. Vera whispered her name and said, she is waking to what she is, not just who she is, and it is happening faster than I expected. Raynor asked, what will she become? And Vera answered, something that cannot be controlled by fear or force, something that remembers what came before. Suddenly, the station lights flickered, and Raynor ran to the control panel, checking for signals, and he saw two separate warnings flashing in red. The first was a human warship moving toward their location with orders marked classified and high alert. The second was a larger unknown vessel approaching from deep space with no ID, no language, no heat, just silence and mass. Raynor stepped back and said, they both found us, and they are not here for peace. Vera stood and said, we must protect Luma, because both sides want her for what she can do, not for who she is. Raynor nodded and walked to a storage unit, pulling out an old rifle and a shield generator, and began setting traps across the station hallways. He turned to Vera and said, if they come through that door, you take her and run no matter what happens to me. Vera shook her head and said, we stay together or we fall apart, because that is how families survive. Raynor looked at her, and something in his chest warmed, though fear still clung to him like cold wind. Outside the station, the human warship arrived first and sent a small team to the docking bay, moving in silence with weapons drawn and orders to retrieve or neutralize the target. The same time, the dark alien vessel stopped far from the station and opened a hatch without sound, releasing something into space, something that moved like smoke and shadow with red lights blinking like eyes. The human soldiers entered the station and moved through the halls while Raynor watched them from a camera feed. Breathing slow and ready, one soldier stepped on a trigger plate, and a flash of light threw him back while the others took cover, shouting commands through static-filled radios. Raynor said, they are too fast. I cannot hold them long. And Vera grabbed his arm and pointed toward the camera, where the shadow was now entering the other side of the station. The humans and the shadow were about to meet, and Raynor said, this is no longer a battle. It is a storm. The shadow moved through walls and light, and took shape only when close, like a mirror of fear with a voice that sounded like many whispers at once. Human soldiers opened fire, but their bullets passed through the creature like water through wind, and then Silence followed. Raynor watched with wide eyes and said, "We are trapped between a force that kills and a force that controls, and both are blind to truth." Luma stood now awake with the crystal shining like a small star in her hand, and her eyes glowing with colors not seen in human skies. She stepped forward and said one word that echoed through the metal walls of the station and stopped the shadow. In its path, the word had no meaning in human language, but it held power like a memory older than time. Shadow paused and then slowly turned away, moving back into the void, as if called by something stronger than hate. Raynor looked at Luma and said, "What did you do?" And she answered, "I showed it who I am." But outside, the human warship still waited, and now sent more teams toward the station with orders. Unchanged. Raynor said, "We need to escape now before they reach us again," and Vera nodded. While holding Luma close, he activated the emergency thrusters of the pod and prepared for launch while alarms rang and metal doors closed behind them. As the pod left the station, the human ships began to fire, but a barrier of light appeared around the pod, coming from the crystal itself, blocking every shot. Raynor whispered to himself, "She is not just a child, she is something far beyond us." And as they moved into the dark sky again, Luma smiled and the stars above shimmered in quiet answer. The stars burned brighter now, and space no longer felt silent, as if every corner of the galaxy had turned its eyes toward one small child sitting quietly inside a damaged pod, drifting through unknown paths. Captain Raynor sat beside Luma with his hand gripping the edge of the console as alarms blinked softly around him and warnings filled the screen with numbers he could not stop. Vera stood near the back, holding onto the wall as the pod shook gently, caught between two forces that should never have met, one of steel and fire, the other of silence and memory. Raynor said, "They are still following us, both of them, and they will not stop until they have her or destroy her." Vera replied, "Then we show them she is not theirs to take and not theirs to fear." Luma looked up, her eyes glowing like twin moons, and her voice came soft like a breeze across water. She said, "They do not see, they only want, and they only fear, but I can show them." Raynor touched her shoulder and said, "How?" And she only smiled, as if the answer lived not in words, but in something deeper than language behind. Then the human warship closed in, ready to fire, with orders from command and fear in every heartbeat of its crew. Ahead of them, the ancient vessel opened wide with lights pulsing slowly like a heart waking from sleep, waiting for Luma to return to something she never knew. She left. Raynor turned on the broadcast system and spoke to both forces with a voice steady as stone and heavy as truth. He said, "This child is not your weapon, not your prisoner, not your answer to old fears. She is more, and you will not touch her." Reply came only silence from humans and shadows from the other side. But the weapon still charged, and the danger still grew. Vera said, "They will never listen." And Raynor replied, "Then we make them see." Luma closed her eyes and held the crystal in both hands, and the light grew stronger until the small pod seemed to vanish into a white field floating between stars and war. Inside that light, a vision formed for both ships to see, a memory shared without permission, without filter, without defense. They saw a planet full of life and laughter where humans and her kind once walked together, building something greater than fear and stronger than greed. They saw betrayal not by aliens, but by leaders who feared peace more than war, and who chose silence over truth. They saw Vera running with Luma through burning fields, not as enemies, but as survivors. They saw Raynor lowering his weapon, not in weakness but in choice and in courage. And when the light faded, the guns remained silent, and both ships held their fire for the first time in hours. Raynor looked outside and saw the human ship pull back slowly while sending one message that said, "Standing by awaiting new orders." The ancient vessel did not move, but sent a wave of calm that wrapped around the pod like a warm wind in the middle of winter. Vera turned to Luma and said, "What did you show them?" And the child answered, "I showed them everything. But peace does not come without price, and choice does not end with one truth." From the human ship, a second signal arrived, this time from Earth Command, saying, "Return the child, or be marked as enemy of the state." Raynor read the words and felt the weight of every line pressing against his chest like iron chains. He turned to Vera and said they will come again, and next time they will bring more than ships Vera held. Luma closed and said, then we must go where they cannot follow Raynor. Stood silent for a long moment, and then reached into the pod's main control and pulled the beacon chip from its core, disabling all signal trace. Handed the chip to Vera and said, this means I cannot return. This means I choose you both over everything else. She looked at him with eyes full of thanks and sorrow and said, then you are one of us now, Raynor. Smiled with something soft in his eyes and said, I was always meant to be. Ancient ship sent a bridge of light toward their pod, and the three of them stepped into it together, not as soldier and aliens, but as something new, and as they entered the vessel, the door closed behind them with a sound that felt like an ending and a beginning, all at once. Back on Earth, the command room went silent as the beacon vanished, and no trace of the pod remained. Some called it desertion, others called it treason, but one voice in the dark whispered something different. It called it hope. In the deep parts of space where maps end and silence begins, a ship moved across stars carrying a child who had awakened the truth no one could bury. Beside her walked a mother who had lost everything and a soldier who had given up everything, and ahead of them waited a future not written by fear, not ruled by war, not shaped by orders, but guided by choice, the final choice.